All right, we only have 2 more weeks to get in a whole lot of story here. So last week I told you a little bit about Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, who had been exiled 5 times by emperors who wanted him gone, and how he was still writing anyways. So in 367, he listed the exact 27 books that we have in our New Testament. The same 27 that we reflect on in 367 CE. Many believe that this was the first time that this list appeared. But today we follow what happened next. Because a letter, even from a powerful bishop, does not become the Bible all by itself. To understand the councils, you have to first understand what changed in 313 CE. This is one that we know, but we may not fully understand the impact of. Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. In some ways, it was really good news. There was no more hiding, no more persecution. Christians could worship openly, they could build buildings, and they could hold property. But that shift also meant that the church went from being a movement of outsiders to being an institution with imperial backing. And empires require clarity. A scattered movement can hold a level of theological ambiguity that an empire will not let pass. So the pressure to define everything, what Christian believed, how we were organized, what books we trusted, became enormous. And the people doing the defining were no longer just the followers of Jesus. Now emperors were in the room with them. What the Jesus movement may have lost in that exchange is worth sitting with for a moment. A faith that was born among the poor, the occupied, the margins, was now housed in imperial halls. It's a complicated inheritance that we still have to wrestle with today. The first major council after 313 was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Constantine himself called it, and over 300 bishops traveled to Nicaea in present-day Turkey from across the empire. It was the first of the empire-wide church councils in history. And it was called to settle one specific crisis, the Arian controversy, the one Athanasius had spent his life fighting, the reason that he had been exiled. The teacher, Arius, had been teaching that Jesus was not fully and eternally God, which we talked about last week. So to be clear, what came out of the Council of Nicaea was the Nicene Creed, not the Bible. The canon wasn't even on the agenda. Nicaea was a council about our understanding of Christology, and that is a story for another day. So the councils that did address the canon were smaller and more regional, and they came decades later. In 393 CE, bishops gathered in Hippo in North Africa, which would be present-day Algeria. It was a synod, not an empire-wide council, and the most influential voice in the room was Augustine of Hippo. He threw his full weight behind Athanasius' list of 27 books. We no longer have the proceedings from the council at Hippo. They have been lost to time, but we do know the outcome. And 4 years later, in 397 CE, the Third Synod of Carthage met and summarized what Hippo had decided. And we do have records of that text. It lists the books of the Old and New Testament, closes with 27, and ends with this instruction: the church across the sea shall be consulted, meaning Rome still had an opportunity to weigh in. Athanasius himself was not at either of these council meetings. He had died in 373 CE, 20 years before the Council of Hippo. But his letter and his list had been circulating for a generation. He wasn't in the room, but his witness was. The men at these councils were bishops in the late Roman Empire, North African and Mediterranean, shaped by Roman imperial culture. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. He was a person of color, born under occupation. The men who formalized the canon were shaped by Roman imperial culture, not the culture of Jesus. The disciples, not even the culture of the apostles, or any of the writers of the book that they were canonizing. And to be clear, every single person in these rooms was a man. There is a clear documented lineage of women disciples, women apostles, women leaders, all the way back to Jesus. Mary Magdalene, who the early church called the apostle to the apostles, Phoebe, a deacon, Junia, who was named by Paul as a prominent, strong leader among the apostles. Women were a part of Jesus' movement from the very beginning, and yet they were absent from these rooms and these decisions. And it was more than just absence. New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman note that some of the texts that did not make it into the canon, like the Gospel of Mary, for instance, centered women's voices and women's authority. By the time these councils met, the church had already been moving for generations toward consolidating authority in male hierarchical offices. The voices of the church were only recognized if they already held power. So we can hold two things at once. We can trust that the Spirit was genuinely moving through this process, through the communities who had gathered and read, through the letters that had been penned and shared, that there was hope and faith in what was happening, and we can grieve what we know was lost, who was excluded. Those are not contradictions, they are realities of our honest faith. And then there is Pentecost. The Spirit showed up that day in Jerusalem generations before these councils and spoke in every tongue, not in the language of the empire, but in every language present, including the ones that the empire would never write down. The church at its best has always known that the Spirit does not stay inside the room where the powerful are meeting. The church did not lock God in a book. It said, these are the texts that we trust the most to introduce us to a Spirit that we are still learning. And that Spirit is still moving today as we learn about our church history and grow in our understandings. Will you join me in our hymn of reflection, Spirit of the Living God?